The radio crackled with static over Bagram Airfield at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. All call signs, all call signs. This is Overlord Actual. We have a prairie fire situation developing in the Kunar Valley. Multiple friendly units in contact. Immediate CAS required. The urgency in the controller's voice made every pilot in the ready room freeze mid-conversation, coffee cups suspended halfway to lips. Major Artemis Ghost, Kovach felt her pulse quicken as she studied the tactical display. 37 Navy SEALs from DEVGRU were pinned down in a valley that maps called a terrain feature, but soldiers knew as a killing field. The mission had gone sideways fast. What started as a high-value target capture had devolved into a desperate fight for survival as Taliban fighters poured down from the surrounding ridgelines like water through a broken dam. "Where are the F-22s?" someone asked from across the room. The answer came swift and bitter. "Weather's too thick. Raptors can't get below the cloud deck without losing their stealth advantage. Command won't risk a $200 million asset in that soup." Ghost's weathered hands traced the contours of the valley on her tablet, her gray eyes calculating distances and angles with the precision of someone who'd done this dance too many times. At 42, she was the oldest pilot in the squadron, her face bearing the subtle lines that came from squinting through too many combat sorties. The younger pilots called her grandmother behind her back, never to her face, but she heard the whispers. Too old, too cautious, flying a museum piece in an age of fifth-generation fighters. They didn't know about Fallujah. They didn't know about the convoy she'd saved when her A-10 was the only bird willing to fly through a sandstorm that grounded everything else. They didn't know about the silver star gathering dust in her footlocker, earned during a mission the Pentagon still classified 15 years later. The tactical radio erupted again. "Overlord, this is SEAL Team 6 Actual. We are Winchester on heavy ammunition. Enemy forces advancing from all quadrants. Request immediate danger close support. How copy?" Ghost stood up slowly, her flight suit bearing patches from 3 different wars. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac outside, unglamorous and scarred, its titanium bathtub cockpit painted with 27 mission markers. The Warthog wasn't fast, wasn't stealthy, wasn't particularly pretty, but it could fly through hell itself and still bring its pilot home. "I'll take it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos of the ready room like a church bell through fog. The younger pilots stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed derision. One of them, a hotshot F-16 jockey named Bradford, actually laughed. "Ghost, that's a suicide mission. Even if you make it through the weather, the valley's crawling with MANPADS. You're flying into a meat grinder." She was already walking toward the door, her flight helmet tucked under her arm. Sometimes the meat grinder's exactly where you need to be. Outside, the wind howled across the Afghan mountains with the voice of ancient ghosts, carrying secrets that only the dead could tell. Ghost's boots echoed against the tarmac as she approached her aircraft, each step a countdown to something that would either end in triumph or become another cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms across the world. The A-10's nose art caught her eye in the harsh fluorescent light, a skeletal figure in flowing robes, carrying a scythe and wearing a pilot's helmet. Below it, in fading yellow paint, "Death from Above." She'd painted it herself after her 3rd tour, back when she still believed in clear-cut victories and heroes' welcomes. Now she knew better. Heroes were just people who showed up when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, was already prepping the aircraft. He'd been working on ghost birds for 6 years, through 3 deployments and countless missions that had tested both machine and pilot to their breaking points. Martinez knew better than most that the A-10 wasn't just an airplane. It was a promise. A promise to the grunts on the ground that someone upstairs gave a damn, that someone would come for them no matter what. "She's ready, Major," Martinez called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Full combat load, mixed ball and API in the gun, full complement of Mavericks, and enough 30 Mike to level a city block. He paused, studying her face in the dim light. You sure about this one, ma'am? Weather reports calling for visibility near zero in the target area. Ghost pulled on her helmet, feeling the familiar weight settle on her shoulders like an old friend's embrace. Martinez, you remember what you told me after my first combat mission, when I came back shaking so hard I couldn't sign the maintenance log. The crew chief smiled despite the gravity of the moment. I told you that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being afraid and flying anyway. Those boys down there don't have time for perfect weather or overwhelming odds, Ghost replied, climbing up the ladder to her cockpit. They just need someone crazy enough to believe that impossible is just another word for Tuesday. The cockpit wrapped around her like a second skin as she ran through her pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who could fly this bird in her sleep. Each switch, each gauge, each warning light was a familiar friend in an uncertain world. The A-10 might not be glamorous, but it was reliable in ways that mattered when bullets started flying and good people started dying. As she fired up the twin General Electric turbofans, their distinctive whine cutting through the mountain air, Ghost caught sight of Bradford and the other young pilots watching through the ready room window. Their expressions had shifted from mockery to something approaching concern, though she doubted any of them would admit it out loud. Bagram Tower, this is Hog 01 requesting immediate departure for close air support mission, she called over the radio, her voice steady despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Hog 01, Bagram Tower, you're cleared for immediate departure. Weather conditions in target area are below minimums for visual flight rules. Advise your intentions. Ghost smiled grimly as she advanced the throttles, feeling the warthog begin to roll forward with the inevitability of an avalanche. Tower, I'm switching to instrument flight rules and praying the weather breaks before I run out of altitude. The tower controller's response carried a note of grudging respect. Copy that, Hog 01. Godspeed. As the A-10 lifted off into the storm-darkened sky, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be different from all the others. Not because of the weather, not because of the odds, but because of something deeper, a sense that the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened when an old pilot in an older plane decided that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. The clouds swallowed her aircraft like a hungry mouth, and for a moment, the only sounds in the world were the steady drone of her engines and the whisper of her own breathing inside the helmet. Below and ahead, 37 of America's finest warriors were fighting for their lives in a valley that cartographers had named, but soldiers would remember. Ghost checked her navigation system one more time, said a silent prayer to whatever gods looked after fools and fighter pilots, and banked northwest toward destiny. The mountains rose around her like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed to stretch forever upward into the night sky. Somewhere in that darkness, enemy fighters were moving ammunition and setting up firing positions, turning what should have been a routine extraction into the kind of nightmare that would either end careers or create legends. Through her headset, the radio traffic painted a picture of controlled chaos. SEALs calling for ammunition, medics requesting priority evacuation for wounded, commanders trying to coordinate movement in terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god to frustrate military operations. Any station, this is SEAL Team 6 Actual. We are taking effective fire from all directions. Casualties mounting. Where's our air support? The voice belonged to someone young, someone who was learning that sometimes the difference between living and dying came down to whether someone in a flying machine decided your life was worth the risk. Ghost keyed her radio. SEAL Team 6 Actual, this is Hog 01. I'm inbound to your position, ETA 15 minutes. Can you mark your position with strobes? A pause then. Hog 01, negative on the strobes, too many bad guys with night vision. We'll mark with IR laser on your approach. Be advised, we're counting at least 40 enemy fighters in the surrounding hills, and they've got some kind of anti-aircraft system. Lost a drone about 10 minutes ago. Copy all 6 actual. I'll be coming in from the northwest. Keep your heads down and get ready to paint targets. The weather was getting worse, if such a thing was possible. Ice began forming on her canopy despite the aircraft's anti-ice systems, and turbulence bounced the A-10 around like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Most pilots would have turned back, declared the mission impossible, returned to base to await better conditions. But Ghost had learned long ago that better conditions were a luxury that infantry units in contact couldn't afford. She thought about the young SEALs in that valley, men barely old enough to drink legally, carrying weapons and responsibilities that would have crushed their grandfather's generation. They'd volunteered for this, just as she had, understanding that freedom came with a price tag written in blood and sacrifice. The least she could do was show up when they called. Her radar warning receiver began painting threats as she approached the target area, surface-to-air missile systems that the intelligence reports had somehow failed to mention. Ghost's jaw tightened as she realized this wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a knife fight in a phone booth, with 37 American lives hanging in the balance and an enemy that had come prepared for war. Hog-01, this is Overlord. Be advised, we're showing multiple SAM sites in your target area. Recommend you abort and return to base. Ghost looked down at the valley spread out below her, barely visible through breaks in the cloud cover. Somewhere down there, Americans were bleeding and dying while she flew in relative safety above the weather. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Overlord Hog-01, negative on the abort. I'm going to work. She pushed the nose down and dove into the storm. The world became a kaleidoscope of rain, clouds, and flashing lights as Ghost brought her A-10 down through the weather like a stone through water. Her altimeter unwound with frightening speed, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, as she descended toward a valley floor that she couldn't see but knew was somewhere below, waiting to kill her if she miscalculated by even a few feet. At 4,000 feet, she broke through the cloud deck, and suddenly the world made terrible sense. The valley spread out before her like a bowl of fire, tracer rounds crisscrossing the darkness in deadly geometric patterns, while explosions bloomed like orange flowers against the mountainsides. The SEALs were trapped in what looked like an abandoned village, taking fire from positions that seemed to extend for miles in every direction. SEAL Team 6 Actual Hog-01, I have visual on your position. I'm going to need you to mark targets with that IR laser, and I need you to do it fast. This place is crawling with bad guys. Hog-01 6 Actual, target marked, enemy machine gun position on the ridgeline, bearing 090 from our position. Danger close, say again, danger close. Ghost banked hard to the left, feeling the G-forces press her into her ejection seat as she lined up for her first gun run. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon slung beneath her aircraft held 1,350 rounds of 30 ammunition, each projectile capable of penetrating tank armor, and certainly more than sufficient to ruin the day of anyone foolish enough to shoot at American Special Operations Forces. 6 Actual Hog-01 is in hot, keep your heads down. She squeezed the trigger, and the world erupted in fury. The A-10 shuddered like a living thing as the 7-barrel Gatling gun spat death at 3,900 rounds per minute, the depleted uranium projectiles turning the enemy machine gun position into a crater filled with smoke and silence. The sound was indescribable, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from the earth itself, the voice of America's anger made manifest in high-explosive metal. Outstanding, outstanding, came the voice over the radio. That position is neutralized. We've got another one, bearing 270, about 600 meters up the hillside. But as Ghost pulled up from her first gun run, the night sky suddenly filled with tracers. Not the random, poorly aimed fire of militia fighters, but the precise, disciplined volleys of professional soldiers with professional equipment. Her radar warning receiver screamed as multiple missile systems locked onto her aircraft simultaneously. "Shit," she whispered, then keyed the radio. "6 actual, be advised, you've got some serious air defense down there. This isn't the JV team." A surface-to-air missile streaked past her canopy like an angry comet, close enough that she could see the individual fins spinning as it sought her heat signature. Ghost yanked the stick hard right and dove toward the valley floor, using the terrain to break the missile's lock. The A-10 responded like a faithful horse, its airframe groaning under the stress, but holding together through maneuvers that would have torn apart lesser aircraft. Hog-01, this is Overlord. We're showing multiple missile launches in your area. Request immediate status report. Overlord, I'm still here and still fighting. These guys came loaded for bear. Ghost rolled inverted and dove toward another target the SEALs had marked with their laser, her cannon already spinning up for another gun run. But they forgot one thing: I'm not a bear. I'm a goddamn warthog. The second gun run was a masterpiece of precision flying, the kind of aerial gunnery that took years to master and a lifetime to perfect. Ghost walked her rounds across an enemy mortar position like a farmer sowing seeds, each projectile finding its mark with the inexorable certainty of physics and fury. The explosion was visible for miles, a pillar of fire that briefly turned night into day. But the enemy had learned from the first attack. As Ghost pulled off target, 3 missiles launched simultaneously from different positions, their contrails visible against the storm clouds like the fingers of death reaching up to claim her. This time there would be no evasive maneuvers, no tactical brilliance that could overcome simple mathematics. She was too low, too slow, and too close to the launchers to avoid all 3. Time slowed to a crawl as Ghost's training took over. She pickled off chaff and flare, filling the sky with metallic confetti and blazing decoys designed to confuse heat-seeking missiles. She pulled the aircraft into a climb so steep that her vision began to gray at the edges, her body pressed into the ejection seat with a force that threatened to crush her spine. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered if this was how it would end, not in a blaze of glory, but in a valley whose name she couldn't even pronounce, fighting for men she'd never met in a war that seemed to have no clear ending. The first missile detonated off her left wing, shrapnel peppering the armored cockpit like angry hail. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel in a Christmas display of system failures and damage reports. The second missile lost lock on one of her flares and exploded harmlessly in the distance. The third missile found its mark. The explosion threw Ghost forward against her harness with brutal force, filling the cockpit with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Her left engine was gone, torn away by the blast, leaving her flying on one turbofan and whatever momentum she could coax from the damaged airframe. Hydraulic fluid leaked from a dozen holes in the fuselage, and her primary flight controls were responding sluggishly. Hog-01, this is Overlord. We show you as damaged. Request immediate status report. Ghost coughed, tasting blood in her mouth, and keyed the radio with hands that shook despite her best efforts to control them. Overlord, Hog-01. I've taken a hit, but I'm still flying. Aircraft is damaged but controllable. I'm staying on station. Negative, Hog-01. Return to base immediately. We're scrambling additional assets to continue the mission. In the valley below, another explosion bloomed near the SEAL position, too close for comfort. Ghost could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen enemy positions, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the Americans through sheer volume of fire. The additional assets wouldn't arrive in time. By then, the SEALs would be overwhelmed or dead, and this valley would become another footnote in the long, bloody history of wars fought in mountains that didn't care about the politics of the men dying in their shadows. Overlord, negative on the RTB. I still have ammunition and I still have targets. SEAL Team 6 actual, what's your most pressing threat? The response came back immediately, the speaker's voice tight with pain and exhaustion. Hog 01, we've got enemy forces massing for an assault from the north. Looks like company strength, moving in the open. If they hit us from that direction while we're taking fire from the ridgelines. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Ghost could see the tactical picture as clearly as if she were studying it on a briefing room map. The SEALs were caught in a classic pincer movement, with enemy forces closing from multiple directions while their ammunition ran low and their casualties mounted. Without immediate air support, they would be overrun within minutes. 6 Actual, I copy. I see the target. I'm going to make one more gun run, but I need you to get everyone as far from the northern approach as possible. I'm coming in hot and heavy. Ghost rolled the damaged A-10 into what felt like a controlled fall, her remaining engine screaming as she dove toward the mass of enemy fighters moving across the valley floor. Her airspeed indicator climbed past redline, the aircraft shaking like a paint mixer as aerodynamic forces tried to tear it apart. Warning buzzers filled the cockpit with electronic panic, but she ignored them all. There would be time to worry about structural limits after she dealt with the immediate threat. The enemy soldiers looked up as death approached from the stormy sky above, some of them firing wildly with small arms that couldn't possibly reach her altitude, others diving for cover that wouldn't protect them from what was coming. Ghost could see their faces in her targeting display, young men following orders from commanders who'd promised them victory over the American invaders. She felt no hatred for them, these soldiers who'd probably been farmers or shopkeepers before someone handed them rifles and told them to die for causes they might not even understand. But sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford when American lives were on the line. She squeezed the trigger and sent them to whatever paradise their prophets had promised. The gun run lasted 8 seconds and consumed nearly 200 rounds of ammunition, each projectile finding its mark with mechanical precision. When the smoke cleared, the northern approach looked like a moonscape, cratered and still, with no movement visible anywhere. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Ghost knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Outstanding gun run, Hog 01. That was beautiful work. But the celebration was short-lived. Ghost's remaining engine was running rough, oil pressure dropping as damaged systems began to fail in cascade patterns that her emergency checklists had warned about but never adequately prepared her for. She was losing altitude despite her best efforts to maintain level flight, and her fuel was running dangerously low after the extended combat maneuvering. SEAL Team 6 Actual, this is Hog 01. I'm running low on everything, fuel, ammunition, and altitude. What's your current situation? Hog 01, 6 Actual. The immediate pressure is off, but we're still taking effective fire from multiple positions. We've got 3 urgent surgical casualties and ammunition for maybe 10 more minutes of sustained fighting. Can you stay on station? Ghost looked at her fuel gauge, then at her engine instruments, then at the storm clouds that seemed to press down on her like the weight of the world. Mathematics was a harsh mistress. She had enough fuel to return to base if she left immediately, or enough to stay and fight until her tanks ran dry. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would let her save both herself and the men on the ground. 6 Actual, I can give you 10 more minutes. After that, I'll be swimming home. She spent those 10 minutes like a miser spending his last coins, each second precious beyond measure. 3 more gun runs destroyed enemy positions that had been pouring fire into the SEAL perimeter. 2 Maverick missiles eliminated command posts that were coordinating the attack. And with her final burst of cannon fire, she silenced a sniper who had been picking off Americans from a hidden position in the rocks. When her ammunition was exhausted and her fuel gauge showed only fumes remaining, Ghost pulled her battered aircraft into a climb that she knew might be her last. The valley fell away beneath her, the fires of battle growing smaller as distance turned individual tragedies into anonymous points of light. SEAL Team 6 Actual, this is Hog 01. I'm Winchester and Bingo Fuel. Additional assets should be on station in 20 minutes. Good luck down there. Hog 016 Actual. I don't know how you did it, but you just saved 37 American lives. We won't forget what you've done here today. Ghost smiled despite the pain in her chest, despite the warning lights that painted her cockpit like a Christmas tree, despite the engine that was more smoke than thrust. 6 Actual. It was an honor to fight alongside you. Hog 01 is off station and heading home. But as she turned northwest toward Bagram, climbing through clouds that seemed determined to drag her damaged aircraft from the sky, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that home was a relative concept. Home was wherever Americans were fighting, wherever freedom hung in the balance, wherever someone needed to believe that help was coming even when help seemed impossible. Her radio crackled one final time as she disappeared into the storm. Hog 01, this is SEAL Team 6 Actual. We'll buy the first round when you get back. Ghost keyed the microphone for the last time. I'll hold you to that promise. The flight back to Bagram tested every skill Ghost had learned in 23 years of military flying, every lesson absorbed through fear and fire, and the kind of experience that couldn't be taught in flight schools. Her remaining engine was running on borrowed time, oil pressure fluctuating wildly as damaged seals leaked vital fluids into the storm. Her flight controls were heavy and unresponsive, requiring constant pressure on the stick to maintain anything resembling stable flight. Navigation was a nightmare in itself. Her GPS system had been damaged by shrapnel, leaving her to dead reckon through mountains that all looked the same in the darkness. She flew by instinct and memory, following valleys she'd flown before, recognizing ridgelines by their silhouettes against the storm clouds. At 30 miles out from Bagram, her engine finally gave up the ghost. The turbofan seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal, leaving her to glide through the darkness like a 30,000-pound brick with delusions of flight. Emergency procedures flashed through her mind: airspeed for best glide, alternate landing sites, ejection seat preparation. But she pushed them aside. The A-10 had carried her this far. It would carry her home or they'd crater together. Bagram Tower, this is Hog 01 declaring emergency. I'm 30 miles out. Single engine failure, attempting emergency landing. Hog 01 Bagram Tower. We have crash and rescue standing by. Runway 29 is cleared for emergency approach. Say souls on board and fuel remaining. One soul on board, no fuel remaining. I'm coming in dead stick. The airfield appeared through the rain like a constellation fallen to earth, its lights marking the difference between salvation and catastrophe. Ghost lined up for what pilots euphemistically called a controlled crash, her damaged aircraft descending toward the runway with all the grace of a wounded eagle. She touched down harder than any landing in her logbook, the main gear slamming into concrete with an impact that rattled her teeth and sent warning lights cascading across her instrument panel. The nose wheel collapsed on rollout, sending sparks streaming behind the aircraft as it scraped to a stop in a shower of metal and rubber. Emergency vehicles surrounded the A-10 before it had fully stopped moving, firefighters and medics converging on the cockpit with practiced efficiency. Ghost shut down her systems and popped the canopy, tasting the sweet night air of Afghanistan, sweet because she was alive to taste it. Staff Sergeant Martinez was the first to reach her, his face a study in controlled relief as he helped her climb down from the battered aircraft. "Major, that was some flying. How'd she handle with one engine?" Ghost looked back at her A-10, taking inventory of the damage in the harsh light of the emergency vehicles. The left wing looked like Swiss cheese, the fuselage was peppered with holes, and the entire left side of the aircraft was blackened by fire and explosion. By any reasonable standard, the machine should have fallen from the sky 20 minutes after taking the hit. "Like a shopping cart with a broken wheel," she replied, pulling off her helmet and running a hand through sweat-dampened hair. "But she got me home." The debriefing took 6 hours, and involved more officers than Ghost had seen in one room since her commissioning ceremony. Intelligence analysts wanted to know about enemy positions and capabilities. Operations officers wanted to understand the timeline of the engagement. Flight surgeons wanted to examine her for injuries she insisted she didn't have. And through it all, one question kept recurring. How did you complete the mission when the odds were impossible? Ghost answered as honestly as she could, but how do you explain the moment when training becomes instinct, when fear transforms into focus, when the impossible becomes just another problem to solve? How do you describe the weight of responsibility for lives you've never seen, the knowledge that turning back means abandoning people who trusted you to be there when they needed you most? The final question came from a colonel she didn't recognize, a man with the kind of ribbons on his chest that suggested he'd been asking hard questions in dangerous places for most of his career. Major Kovac, in your professional opinion, what made the difference in this mission? What turned a potential catastrophe into a tactical success? Ghost considered the question for a long moment, thinking about 37 Navy SEALs who were probably back at their forward operating base, alive because someone had decided that impossible was just another word in the dictionary. Sir, I think it came down to showing up. Everything else, the tactics, the technology, the firepower, none of that matters if you don't show up when people are counting on you. Those SEALs needed to know that someone upstairs gave a damn about their lives. The A-10 might not be the fanciest bird in the Air Force, but when Americans are bleeding and dying, it shows up. Every time. The colonel nodded slowly, making notes in a file that Ghost suspected would disappear into the classified archives, where stories like this one waited for historians brave enough to tell the truth about what war actually cost. 3 days later, as Ghost sat in the base hospital having her ribs examined for the third time, the flight surgeons insisted she had cracked ribs from the missile blast, though she felt fine. Staff Sergeant Martinez appeared in the doorway with news about her aircraft. Major, I thought you'd want to know. We finished the damage assessment on your bird. She took 17 direct hits from small arms fire, shrapnel damage from at least 3 separate explosions, and that SAM blast damn near took off the whole left wing. Ghost winced as the doctor pressed against her side, feeling the deep ache that she'd been ignoring for 3 days. What's the verdict? Is she repairable? Martinez grinned, the kind of smile that mechanics reserved for aircraft that had somehow defied the laws of physics and common sense. Major, by all rights that plane should have crashed in the valley. The fact that it brought you home, well, let's just say there are some things that can't be explained by maintenance manuals. She's going to need some work. Hell, she's going to need a complete rebuild, but the airframe's solid. Give me 6 weeks and some spare parts, and I'll have her ready to go hunting again. That evening, Ghost walked out to the flight line where her A-10 sat in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by scaffolding and spare parts like a mechanical patient in intensive care. The nose art that had seemed so appropriate 3 days earlier, the skeletal figure in pilot's helmet, now looked almost prophetic. Death from above, indeed. But as she studied the damage to her aircraft, Ghost realized that something had changed in the way people looked at her. The younger pilots who had called her grandmother now nodded with something approaching respect when she passed in the corridors. The maintenance crews worked on her aircraft with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum pieces. And in the ready room, her mission report had been photocopied and passed around until it looked like samizdat literature from behind the Iron Curtain. Word of the rescue had spread through the special operations community with the speed of electronic gossip, reaching forward operating bases and secret facilities from Kabul to Somalia. A master chief she'd never met stopped her in the chow hall to thank her for bringing his SEALs home. A Delta Force operator bought her a beer and told her that the story was already becoming legend in the black operations community. But the moment that mattered most came when she received a package with no return address, delivered through channels that officially didn't exist. Inside was a photograph, 37 men in combat gear, standing in front of a helicopter at some undisclosed location. On the back, someone had written, "To Ghost, thanks for showing up when showing up was everything. DEVGRU sends." Ghost tucked the photograph into her flight suit pocket, where it would stay for the remainder of her deployment. It wasn't much to look at, just soldiers posing for a camera, but it represented something that couldn't be measured in mission reports or efficiency ratings. It represented the reason she joined the Air Force in the first place, back when she was young and idealistic enough to believe that one person could make a difference in a world that seemed determined to crush hope wherever it found it. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, grinding through administrations and strategies and acronyms that looked good in PowerPoint presentations, but rarely survived contact with reality. Ghost would fly 47 more combat missions, each one a small story of courage and calculation, fear and fury. She would train younger pilots who looked at her with the kind of awe usually reserved for living legends, and she would try to teach them that being a hero wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and showing up anyway. But none of those missions would carry quite the same weight as the one that earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and a reputation that preceded her to every assignment for the rest of her career. When other pilots spoke of impossible missions and last-ditch rescues, they spoke of Ghost Kavach and the night she dove into hell to pull out 37 American Angels. Years later, when she was teaching tactics at the Air Force Academy and her students asked her about the mission that made her famous, Ghost would always give the same answer. "I wasn't special. The aircraft wasn't special. What made the difference was showing up when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. When Americans are in trouble, we don't count the odds. We count the lives we can save." The A-10 Thunderbolt II would eventually be retired from service, deemed obsolete in an era of fifth-generation fighters and drone warfare. Politicians would debate its replacement, analysts would crunch numbers about cost-effectiveness, and bureaucrats would write memos about strategic priorities. But for the men and women who flew it, and for the soldiers on the ground who heard its distinctive engine note in their darkest hours, the Warthog would always represent something that couldn't be quantified or replaced. It represented the promise that help was coming, no matter the odds. And sometimes, in a world full of broken promises and abandoned hopes, that's all the hero you need. Ghost retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, her final assignment teaching close air support tactics to a new generation of pilots who would never know the Afghanistan she'd known. Her farewell speech was brief and to the point, delivered to an audience that included generals and airmen, maintenance chiefs and fresh-faced lieutenants who still believed that war could be clean and surgical. "Flying isn't about the machine," she told them, standing before a backdrop that featured every aircraft she'd ever flown. "It's about the mission, and the mission isn't about targets or tactics or even winning wars. The mission is about bringing people home. When you understand that, really understand it, everything else becomes just technical details." She left the service with a chest full of medals and a logbook full of stories, but what she carried with her wasn't the recognition or the awards. What she carried was the knowledge that, when it mattered most, she'd shown up. 37 times over, she'd proven that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. The last entry in her flight log read simply, "Mission complete, all souls accounted for." It was, she thought, a pretty good way to end a career. But some stories don't end with retirement ceremonies and farewell speeches. Some stories live on in the lessons they teach and the lives they touch, passed down from instructor to student, from veteran to rookie, from one generation of warriors to the next. The story of Ghost Kavach and her impossible rescue became part of the Air Force's institutional memory, a reminder that courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about showing up despite the fear. Young pilots would study the mission parameters and shake their heads at the odds, whether below minimums, heavy air defenses, enemy forces in overwhelming numbers, and an aircraft that belonged in a museum rather than a war zone. By any rational calculation, The mission should have failed catastrophically. But they would also study the results: 37 lives saved, enemy forces neutralized, and an old pilot in an older plane proving that sometimes the impossible was just Tuesday in disguise. The A-10 that carried Ghost through that storm-lashed valley was eventually repaired and returned to service, its battle damage patched and painted over until it looked almost new again. But if you knew what to look for, you could still see the scars, slight variations in the paint, subtle differences in panel alignment, the kind of details that only maintenance crews and obsessive pilots ever noticed. Staff Sergeant Martinez, promoted to Technical Sergeant and eventually to Master Sergeant, would spend the rest of his career working on A-10s. He never forgot the night he helped Ghost climb down from her battered aircraft, never forgot the way she looked back at the machine that had carried her through hell and brought her home again. In the maintenance hangar, he kept a photograph from that night, Ghost standing beside her bullet